Hello, everybody. It looks like people have started to filter in. So welcome to this, What the fucking are? What the fuck is Conway's Law with Michael, myself, Jamie Dobson, and of course, all of the team from Container Solutions. Now, usually we give people a few minutes to sort of shuffle in. Sometimes they've been, well, in the olden days, people were late leaving one meeting and entering into another one. But nowadays, in the pandemic world, that tends to be a lot easier because you just click close on one Zoom window and enter into another. So while people are filtering in, and there are currently about 51, so that's going to go up a little bit in the next few minutes. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We do have a code of conduct. My colleague Carla is about to share this in the chat box. Now, the code of conduct basically says that we will respect each other, treat each other well. You can click the link if you want to read the long form version. If you need this version for your own events, feel free to copy it and use it as you wish. What other housekeeping, Carla, have I forgotten?
We are recording the webinar.
That's usual. Right.
Yeah.
We are recording the webinar. If you've got an issue with appearing on the video, let us know and we will edit you out so that when we upload this later to YouTube, you will not appear. If you've got a real issue with being recorded, unfortunately, it's probably you who has to leave because we like to record these for the rest of the community. Now, most people who come to the What the Fucking R's are regulars, so you know the format. But for those people who are new, typically we do the following. 2 or 3 minutes announcements, housekeeping and things like that. Then we have guests to discuss industry gossip, what's happening in the world of cloud native and the wider field of technology. And then we get into the main event, which is, of course, today about Conway's Law with Michael. Michael, hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, it's good. Where are you dialing in from today?
Thousand Oaks, California. It's about 40 miles north of Los Angeles.
Right. And I'm guessing that means it's morning for you right now.
Yeah, it's about 7:30 or so in the morning.
Yeah, right. Okay. So usually in the webinars, depending on where you are, on the East Coast, they're having lunch. In California, they're having breakfast. And in Europe, they've started drinking already.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of like fresh and ready to go. It's kind of like
I can imagine.
For the audience, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think we've leveled off now in terms of people dropping into the webinar. So I'm going to continue now with the rest of the slides, and then we're going to bring in Adrian and Ricardo to give us the latest news before bringing in Michael for the main session. Right, so housekeeping, I've done that. Announcements, I'm going to do now. Our book, it's a bestseller, at least in the world of cloud native. Our book is currently free to download. So all of the patterns in the book and all of our method for cloud native transformation is available anyway online, whether in the patterns repository or different parts of our website. So one way or another, you could always get access to the content in the book. But right now, for a limited period, we've got the whole book ready to download. I think it's a dense book, but if you're going to do cloud native and cloud native transformation, most of our customers absolutely love it, and it really gets them going in the right direction. So if you want to grab a free copy, please do so. We are not a spammy company. If you don't want us to follow up on emails and things like that, just click the button that says I don't need anything else from you, and you will never hear from us again. If you are interested in the newsletter, which comes out every month, it is really cool, actually. You can click the checkbox for that. Alternatively, just click the things that you are interested in. That's available for a few months at least. Speaking of the newsletter, our newsletter is called What the Fuck is Cloud Native? This is, of course, based on the industry truth that nobody actually knows what cloud native is. Some people think it's utility computing that you get from Amazon. Other people think it's microservices continuously deployed. And our newsletter is basically what's the word, Carla? Our newsletter is the coat stand in which we hang off our discussion. So we constantly revisit this question: what is cloud native? Sometimes we touch observability, other times we touch culture, but it's extremely popular and the content is really cool. So if you want to subscribe, click the link below, which is in the chat box, or take a picture of that QR code. We do swear a lot, even when we're not trying to. So that's just a bit of a caveat there. Next webinar, my last one of April, and actually it might be my last one for a while as I start to think about handing over to my colleague Ian Crosby, but definitely the last webinar in April will be with Matthew Skelton. Matthew is the author of Team Topologies, and what we tend to do in when we think about platforms is look at cloud native from how we organize and how information flows. So this is going to be the very last day of April, I think, or the second to last day. The first time Matthew spoke, we broke records for the number of people who came to the webinar. So I'm not sure if we're going to do that again, but let's see. And that brings us up to our favorite piece of the day. What the fuck is the gossip? This is where we like to share industry news. This feature started during the pandemic. Everybody was fed up. So this goes all the way back to last June and July. People missed the hallway tracks and conferences. People felt disconnected. Container Solutions started publishing all kinds of things. Mental health guidelines was something we focused on. Bringing people together in small breakout rooms was another one. We also had the Container Solutions pub, but then at one point we thought maybe we shouldn't be encouraging people to drink so much. And lots of different initiatives came out of that period. And one of them was WTF goss. And this was because people wanted to talk about other parts of the industry, but didn't necessarily have time, I don't know, to click around. And so that was how this started. And now with that in mind, I'm in the biggest gossip monger, not just in Container Solutions, but in our whole community. Can't shut him up, cannot trust him with a secret. Adrian, are you there?
I am, I hope.
Hello, mate. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah. How is sunny Scotland?
It actually is very sunny. I'm hoping I'll get out before the sun sets, but we'll see.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, so for everybody who's new to the webinars, Adrian is my colleague from Container Solutions. He's also the author of the best-selling O'Reilly book, Using Docker, but that's not for free. You've still got to pay for that. It's because he's too tight, right, Adrian?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, sorry, that was just a jab at me. No, I was kidding. Okay, Adrian, what gossip have you got for us today?
Yeah, do you want to move the slide forward?
Yeah, I can.
So, a slightly thorny topic, but it probably is the largest topic on the or Twitter at the minute, is Richard Stallman got re-elected to the Free Software Foundation board, which is extremely controversial to say the least. A lot of people were pretty surprised and blindsided by this. The reason he stepped down, I know a specific issue over a blog he wrote, but he has historic sort of behavior and attitudes that are basically deeply problematic. I don't want to go into details about them. You can look them up, but it's especially sort of attitude towards the way he treated staff and women especially. And it's controversial enough, and there's enough of an outcry that I believe the director of the FSF has quit, the deputy director has quit, and the CTO has quit over this. Obviously, there's a lot of outrage over Twitter, and a lot of companies and organizations have started pulling support for the Free Software Foundation. I should say there is also support from the other end, so there has been an open letter of support for RMS that has been signed. One interesting thing is also the news reporting it as signed by mainly Russians and Europeans. I'm not entirely sure what that was insinuated there. I thought it was interesting. Yeah, so I don't want to say anything more about that. On to a more interesting, but arguably also controversial one, is the Coinbase IPO. So this happened yesterday. Technically, it wasn't an IPO, it was a DPO. So an IPO is an initial public offering, but this was actually a DPO, a direct public offering, because it didn't create new shares. It just sold a bunch of shares that people had already. They just made them available. Now, most of you are aware that Coinbase is a crypto exchange. So basically, you can buy and sell Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. on Coinbase. It is a pretty lucrative market because they charge reasonably high transaction costs, especially if you compare Coinbase to something like, I don't know, Fidelity or wherever you buy and sell stocks and shares. You'll find that the Coinbase takes a bigger percentage. Now, the reason this is seen as a big thing is because it's seen as sort of legitimizing cryptocurrency, if you like. And now that it's floated in the stock exchange, people think, it's a reliable company to go and trade with, and also that it's an indicator that the government supports crypto to some extent. I'm not really sure if that's true, but that's certainly the way it's seen, and it's being reported, if you like.
Adrian, currently in the underground in London, there are advertisements for Bitcoin, and the advertisement goes something like this: if you're seeing this advertised on the underground, it's definitely the right time to buy.
I think of I know that company. It's Floor or something. Floor, I can't remember. Yeah, I know that company.
Yeah, I mean, this funny thing about Bitcoin is people or cryptocurrencies, people just cannot get their heads around the carbon footprint, right? And the environmental sort of strain that this places on our resources and energy consumption.
Right. To be fair, I think that's easier level at Bitcoin, and that's absolutely true. That's not necessarily a feature of cryptocurrency. So like you see Ethereum is trying to move and has been trying to move for several years. It's like a proof of stake, I believe, model that doesn't necessarily have the huge electricity costs associated with it. So that part of it is solvable, and it's quite sad that we've not really done that, and it's still Bitcoin and this proof of work. So the proof of work algorithm is the one that uses all electricity, and it's quite sad we're still stuck on that algorithm, really. Yeah.
Right, one more piece of gossip. Who's doing this one? Is it you or Ricardo?
Yeah, that's me.
Hey, Ricardo,
hey everyone.
This is your first What the Fucking Are. Welcome along.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, I got a story regarding Intel and NVIDIA. Intel's life has just become more difficult this week. Intel dominates the markets for server and laptop processors. However, it has had a few rough months. This desktop market share just got overtaken by AMD. Apple stopped using Intel processors. You might have seen it all over the news. It's also struggling with deploying the 7 nanometer chips, while AMD already launched them a couple years ago. Now, in addition to all of these challenges, this week NVIDIA announced it will produce its first CPU chip for data centers. This may actually be a serious challenge to server dominance of Intel. I mean, apart from being a serious competitor, NVIDIA agreed to and signed an acquisition of ARM, I think late last year. ARM, which is the chip design company which licenses its architecture to manufacturers. And this deal is still pending approval by competition authorities in a few countries. But if it does go through, it could be super important. ARM architecture absolutely dominates the mobile devices space because it is super energy efficient. Now, NVIDIA having this energy efficiency know-how in-house will certainly make it like a significant contender in the server market and it'll probably threaten Intel's dominance. So yeah, exciting times in this space.
And of course, recently, ARM was actually bought by a Japanese company, wasn't it? But it looks like it's been
SoftBank.
SoftBank. It's changing hands after just a few years. And recently, I think Intel brought back a veteran to the CEO position to try to turn things around for them.
Exactly. And Intel's stock price has already gone up quite a bit since he joined.
Very cool. Okay, this is some good gossip. Michael, what are things doing on your side of the Atlantic? Are these stories big news for you as well?
Yeah, I guess I've seen all those except for the NVIDIA one. Yeah, the Coinbase IPO was kind of exciting yesterday. I'm not involved in any sense, but it's kind of cool to go and see where things are going with that. Yeah, the Richard Stallman stuff is kind of like, it's almost like a bad dream coming back in a way,
Yeah. Some things don't change, right? Especially where us human beings are concerned.
Fair enough.
Right. On that note, it does bring us apart in the webinar where the gossip is finished and I get to introduce Michael. But before I do that, I would like to tell a very personal story and how Michael actually, he might not be fully aware of his significance in this story. But many years ago, Adrian, when were we at Edinburgh together? Adrian, did you just hang up in the middle of my epic story?
I'm here. I had to get the dog because he was like growling outside the door.
But when were we in Edinburgh together?
2003, maybe?
2002, 2003. So Adrian and I, we were both computer science graduates, and then we both studied high performance computing. So that back then, that was grid computing, submitting jobs to supercomputers that were, hosted in Manchester. One of them was, and back then I was a Java. Right? Say that again.
The good old days, right?
The good old days, which was basically less than 20 years ago. So it really shows how much we've traveled. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in, Java at large scale, because we knew we'd be building large scale distributed systems and Java might become the language of choice. Now, about a year after that, I was only 27, 28. I landed myself in a role as a technical team lead at KLM in the Netherlands, where I was living. And at the time, we didn't have Slack and we didn't have Twitter like, we have it now. We used to communicate through conference papers. So, for example, when I first learned about Steve Freeman and Nat Price's object-oriented testing frameworks and mock objects, I read that in a paper, which I printed and then wrote on. And anyway, so I was in the Netherlands, and we were moving KLM's infrastructure to make it possible to buy an airplane ticket or to book a flight, to look at the timetables online. We couldn't have known it at the time, but we were doing to the travel industry exactly what Amazon were doing to the book industry, and that Netflix would very soon do to the video shop industry. Yeah. And slowly and surely, all of these shops vanished from the high street. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I get myself a ticket for the SPA conference in the United Kingdom. This was Michael, what was this? It's a right mouthful. The Conference for the Advancement of the Software Profession.
Software process advancement, I think, or something.
Software process advancement. So at the time, I discovered a number of patterns for refactoring legacy code, which of course Michael had written the book on. But I'd done that without reading your book, Michael. I'd also started to twiddle about with mock objects before I knew about what Freeman and Price were doing. And I came to this conference, a very young person, very green, very naive, and was welcomed by such a huge sort of outpouring of support and love. And lots of people saying to me, you really want to quit working for somebody else and do something for yourself, which is exactly what I did. As soon as the conference was over, Michael was one of those people. So I got a copy of the signed book and I quit. Within 2 weeks of that conference, I quit. In a fit of rage, and said, I'm going to do this myself. All those lessons we learned at KLM around configuration, automated tests, performance tests, that became it was a tongue-in-cheek conference paper from me called Conservative XP. I took a load of extreme programming practices and I mashed together some sort of old-fashioned planning because we couldn't get the servers, Michael. We couldn't get our hands on them. It was like a 12-week cycle to run some tests. Yeah. And no amount of sort of pair programmer would get around this physical constraint. Anyway, all of the ideas there around culture, technology, and the outpouring of warmth from you and the outpouring of support from people like you led me to become an entrepreneur. And that essentially became Container Solutions. And if not many people ask me, what do Container Solutions do? I say, cloud native. Mm-hmm. I honestly think what we do is XP for the cloud.
Oh, very cool.
And that started that day. So to you, I just want to say this. Thank you. It was probably just another conference for you, but for me, it was a really life-changing couple of days.
I'm really glad of that. And really, to me, that kind of like shows the importance of having a scene in a way, around like technology, methodology, all these different things. And, I kind of look forward to the day where basically we're all able to meet in person again and have these kind of like, the idol bump into somebody and it's like, oh, wow, we have a conversation and it changes somebody's life. I think that's the more that we can do that kind of stuff, overall, the better off we all are, so it's good stuff.
I'll never forget it. And what I think the biggest thing I took away was confidence. One day before that conference, I was just me. And one day after, I thought, hey, there's this guy who writes about legacy Java and some of this I've picked up on my own. And there's another guy who does mock objects. And hey, I almost discovered this on my own. So I went from being quite shy to actually something, hey, maybe I can be an entrepreneur. It only took me 16 years after that to put it together, but
It's all good. There's nothing like finding like-minded people and being on the edge of something. I love it.
It was a good community. It was a really cool community. Right, on that note, so thank you for letting me recount the story, everybody on the webinar today. So that might give you another angle as to what we do at Container Solutions, extreme programming with a bit of cloud chucked in. On that note, it is with significant pleasure that I get to introduce Michael Feathers today. He's going to be talking about what the fuck is Conway's law, and of course, what's its relation to how we build systems. You can ask questions in the chat. There's a load of people who have submitted questions in advance. I'm going to facilitate and get to these after Michael's finished his presentation. So without further ado, please unmute your microphones and give a huge Container Solutions welcome to Michael Feathers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go and do my screen share.
Yeah, Jamie, you can stop sharing. Yeah,
Let me-
okay, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, all good.
Okay. Am I? Whoops. Okay. This is very strange. Am I going in?
Yeah, but we were seeing, the first page, Michael. It's all good.
Okay, sounds good. I do have a strange thing going on here where I have the participants tab.
So we can, from our perspective, Michael, it looks great. So you might have a weird setup on your side, but we see everything in full screen, right, Carol?
Technology, what can you do, right? Yeah, okay, so, good afternoon, everybody. And it's great to be here. And, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jamie. And I'm really glad to go and be here to go and discuss all these things with you. So yeah, basically going to talk about what Conway's law is, right? And I think the thing that is kind of interesting is that it just dawned on me like a couple of days ago that really Conway's law is an English muffin. Okay. Do you have English muffins in England? I'm not sure whether you do or not. I don't know. There's that big thing of like, is it a crumpet or not, right? So I started doing a little bit of research, okay? And it turns out that there's differences, but honestly, I mean, I don't really see the differences that much. I've been to England and I get, what I think is an English muffin and it looks kind of like a crumpet and I'm like, what the hell? So, it's a very strange thing with this too, because I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to talk about this, but is English muffin really the right term? Or do they use a different term over there? Is this just kind of like, like we use the term French fries in America, but they're chips over there, so I went down, a bit of a rabbit hole trying to figure this stuff out yesterday. But, and to get back to that a little bit later, you might not see the connection between Conway's law and English muffins yet, but by the end of this talk, you really will. And you'll be kind of like stunned and just, you'll have something wonderful you can basically discuss over breakfast with all of your friends, right? So let's go and move into Conway's law, and then we'll inch our way back towards English muffins. So Conway's law was basically first articulated by Melvin Conway back in 1968, which is, really, really prehistory for so much of us, but he made this very interesting observation about systems. And it was funny because it took him a while to go and actually get it published. What he basically recognized was that when you have teams working on some kind of a design project, the structure of the teams ends up getting reflected in the thing that they're producing, right? And it's interesting about this because it's kind of presented a bit as like a mystery in a way. It's kind of like, it's like you've got, the team structure, and then it ends up going and being reflected into the organization structure. And why should this happen? And usually when people hear about this for the first time, they're a little bit, they're kind of like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I've seen that happen. And they think about 4 or 5 instances in their experience where they basically see the structure of what they produce being, kind of echoed from the team structure that's producing it. And I think in the early days in particular, it was really kind of rough because we weren't really as used to changing organizational structure as we are these days. So there's always like this kind of like thinking, oh no, it's kind of like we're doomed now, right? Because we have an organization structure that's primarily defined by, say, politics in a way. So that's our architecture. It's like, why even have an architect? Our architecture is basically determined by, the structure of our organization that we can't really change at all. But we've gotten better and better in the industry about going and changing organizational structure, and that's absolutely great. But what I want to talk about in this talk is really kind of like the implications of this and what that really means for us now in more modern architectures. So let's go ahead and move over to this. This is a log, right? Somebody basically chopped this tree in half and you see all those rings there. This is what your software is like, okay? Your software is like a log. Wait, no, I just talked about English muffins, right? No, your software is like a log now, all right? And it's like a log in this sense that, it's kind of like you can see the growth in your software. You can see the history of your project in your software, right? And it's really worth doing this. If you can basically go and sort of like teleport yourself back through Git, you can quite often go and see, oh, wow, it's kind of like, there was like really a stressful situation in our company's history like 3 years ago. and you look at the code produced in that period, and you'll quite often find that some of the code was a little bit messier, just because things tend to be way deeper connected than quite often we expect to see in projects and stuff like that. And it's really kind of a funny thing for us, overall, because typically when we're making changes in a system, we're just looking at the current code that we've got. We see the code in its current, we see the current branch. We see everything that's happening with it. Occasionally we'll go back like 2 or 3 versions just to go and get a sense of what's kind of happened in the most recent past. But really, code kind of like bears the history of a project in a very interesting way. And this is kind of an interesting, application of Conway's law also, right? I think that the interesting thing about Conway's law is that it's not just going and saying, hey, you've got a team structure and ends up going and mirroring itself in software structure, but also kind of like there's the quality aspect as well. If there are communication problems on a team, quite often you'll see them in the code also. And this is a strange thing to get your head around, right? I see this happen quite often in organizations where you have a group of people working together and they are a team, and the code isn't as good as it could be. And it really comes down to insufficient directness on the team about, well, I really think this isn't such a good way of doing things, but I'm just going to kind of let it go because I don't want to sort of like dig into my coworker and tell them what the right way is to go and design something, right? Because we know that that path leads us down into all kinds of crazy arguments, and we don't want to be contentious. But if we don't really have a good way of going and communicating about what we see as better in design and reaching agreements about it, then code's just going to go and deteriorate internally a bit. So the big story of Conway's law is not just that your design is going to mirror the structure of the team, but it's pretty much that almost anything that happens in the team space is going to start to reflect itself down into the software somehow, right? And, it's kind of an interesting thing to go and notice. And once you do, you have more ways of going and diagnosing things. And you have also ways of going and actually through the social realm, going and attacking technical problems. So let's go a little bit further, okay? There's something that's called the inverse Conway maneuver, okay? Which is all about going and saying, oh, okay, if the team structure ends up going and changing the software, okay, in such a way that you start to have subsystems subsystems kind of like arise around teams and stuff like that. Why don't we basically use that as a design tool? And some people try to do that. They say, okay, I want to go and have a boundary between 2 areas of software. So I'm going to create 2 separate teams. And then over time, that code is going to start to separate in a way, right? The reason why this is supposed to happen is because it costs more to go and talk across teams than to talk inside of a team. So naturally, you're going to start having discussions over here about this particular area of code, and then people over there will have discussions about the code. And then you'll be in this situation where it's kind of like, okay, well, then that's your code and this is my code. And we have to go and develop an interface between your code and my code. And this is the dynamic that kind of occurs where you start to go separate things because you have separate teams working with separate, areas of responsibility. So that can happen. But the thing about the inverse Conway maneuver is it's really most powerful in the very beginning of a project. And that's essentially because of this, that essentially systems have memory. And in fact, systems are memory in a way, right? Remember I showed you the cut tree log, and you can basically see all the growth rings and stuff like that. In much the same way, if you take a sapling, like a baby tree, and you kick it out in a field someplace, it's never going to grow completely right again, okay? It'll grow off to the side, and of course the growth is going to go such that the leaves grow towards the sun and everything. But systems don't just sort of like right themselves, okay? They start to grow in a particular direction, they'll continue to grow in that direction, but also seek, true north, the sunlight in a way. And, for us, if you're going to carry this right back down into software, that basically means that some of the earliest architectural decisions we make are really, really hard to change because there's a lot of code that's kind of like grown around those decisions. If you have a particular kind of componentization, it's like if you're going to change the componentization radically, yes, you can do that, but it's going to be a lot more work, and it's not going to be very easy to do just by going and saying, let's go and separate teams in a particular way. Okay, I mean, that can be a great adjunct to doing it. But inverse Conway maneuver is a nice thing to do, but it's also one of those things that you can expect is is better applied early in system history or early in a particular area of the system's history. And a lot of this too, this notion that systems have memory kind of plays into the notion that there really are hotspots in systems as well. Some of you have probably heard of the 80-20 rule in a way. It's kind of like there's a little jokey saying that like in scheduling things, it's kind of like 80% of the effort happens in the last 20% of the time or something like that, right? But this general thing is part of what's known as power law distributions or Pareto distributions. And it's really a systems dynamic thing. You'll notice that, like, say on Twitter, for instance, there's like 20% of the people that have 80% of the followers. If you look at Amazon sales, there's like 20% of the books that receive 80% of the sales. What this basically means is that when you have systems where value is generated, you're going to get into a situation where you have certain areas that are going to get a lot more attention than other areas. And this definitely factors into our systems, our code, right? You don't want to get into a situation where you say, let's make the entire system better, because frankly, 20% or 80% of the value comes from 20% of your system. And likewise, about 80% of the effort that you place in your system is probably going to happen in about 20% of the system. And these are the hotspots in your code. A very easy way to see this is to go and basically use Git and do like a Git log of the entire system, and then sort of like bin together all the file changes. And you'll discover that there's some files that are changed a massive number of times, and lots of files have only been changed once or twice, right? So knowing this, it's kind of like it's interesting to know that moving forward in any design, you can concentrate on your effort on the areas where you where you notice the most change and get some of the most benefit going forward with things. But you know, the downside to this as well is it's kind of like a lot of the structure that you have in a system is kind of like baked in already. Okay, so it's kind of hard to go and kind of undo at times. You can, but it's a lot of effort. So Conway's law is great to go and sort of like, you know, help us go and sort of see a system dynamic. The thing that's kind of fascinating for us now is that we've kind of like moved from, what's that on the left? Is it an English muffin? No, it's an apple. We're moving from monoliths to microservices, right? So the age of the monolith is pretty much gone. Most everybody I encounter these days is basically either, you know, in the realm of microservices or on the pathway towards them. And the cool thing about this is that essentially services are bite-sized in a way, right? They're relatively small compared to a huge monolith. And then the question becomes like, wow, can we leverage this with Conway's law in a good way, right? The thing is, even though services are like way bigger than classes, for instance, they're not really the kind of thing where you say, I want to have one team per service, right? You can do that sort of thing, but it's also kind of like, you know, people end up discovering that that's not quite the best way. Usually you have teams that are basically like aligned around clusters of services or particular domains within the system. So we have this thing where we have a boundary in the social realm, like the team. And then there's the thing of like, well, how does that go and impact the architecture that we're basically going and dealing with? And we don't, as of yet, have like a one-to-one mapping that goes and makes things, you know, really nice that way to go and say, yay, team, this one team is for this one particular component. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic as we have architecture changing these days. And we really get into this thing of like, we have microservice architecture, what teams, you know, deserve to be where, you know, where should people be working on these things? The typical thing quite often is to kind of like revert to what was really common in many monolithic architectures, which is to go and say, you know, I'm going to have like these free range teams, almost like feature teams that can touch any service. And then since they touch any service, then they're going to start to go and learn the entire system. But you can also get into this thing that's sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, where basically if everybody can touch anything, they don't really feel particular ownership of any particular thing. So they don't have like this reduced scope where it's like, you know, these are the 10 services that we're responsible for, and we're going to be with them durationally over time. And because of that, we're going to go and start to go and impose our vision of design on these particular areas of code. It's funny about this because this is a Conway's law effect also, in the sense that this thing of like the tragedy of the commons, it's kind of like that's a way of going and seeing that when you let anybody touch anything in a system, things start to degrade over time. it's an effect of team structure upon, technological structure. So I see this really being a form of Conway's law as well. So yeah, there's that. And I think that's really another example of something called the lifetime problem. And what I mean by this is that, if we're looking at the technological systems that we have in the teams in an organization, one of the things that's important to notice is that they typically have different lifetimes. So you have, like, say, certain products in your organization, and they have like development, introduction, growth, maturity, decline. But what about the teams that are responsible for these things? It's kind of quite often the case that you'll have teams where people come and go, right? People leave to go work someplace else, new people come in. And in fact, actually a lot of, what we see as technical debt, right, is just a side effect of this churn that we have in personnel around existing systems. And that has a deleterious effect on things also. So the dynamic is that if your team is changing faster than your code is changing, then you're going to get into a situation where not everybody understands everything that's going on, and then the quality starts to go and suffer. This again is another kind of like Conway's law effect. In the early days of Agile, one of the things that was that happened was there was this notion that that basically you should have business and development be kind of separate and then coordinate them with each other using like features and estimates to go and figure out what to do and when to do next. It's kind of nice to go notice that these days we see far more integrated teams, where basically you have product people on the team, you have developers on the team, you're working together, every single day to go and basically define and implement something. But this thing of going and having development and business separate, it often produces like a Conway's law type effect also, in the sense that, you're going to have a degradation of quality sometimes when basically the business people and development people aren't on the same page. So yeah, that's another dynamic that can happen with some of this. So what can we do about all this, right? It's a strange thing because we have these non-coincident lifetime things where essentially the structure of the team is changing way faster than the structure of the code. We know that we can't sort of like impose a new team structure just to go and sort of like force a change in architecture very easily unless it's something you do very early. But a lot of it really comes down to going in and just sort of like instilling proper guidance within a system. So one of the things I often look at is like, how do you actually sort of like agree on a team to go and deal with problems? And I call this like direction mapping. And you can use some tooling to go and basically figure out where the hotspots are in your system. In this graph here, we basically have on the x-axis, we have churn, number of times the file has changed. And on the y-axis, we basically have complexity, like cyclomatic complexity for the things inside the file. And you'll notice that, for every one of these dots is a file. There's some that really are in the upper right-hand corner, and those are really the dangerous ones. These are areas where you have like massive complexity and you're changing these things all the time, right? Instead of having files here, I can have services, right? We can basically sort of like identify in an organization where are the things that are kind of like falling apart, okay? And then basically concentrate effort on these things. The things in the upper right are definitely things where you want to go and say, look, we want to have a more stringent process about how we change things and focus some effort on them, because if we don't, the graph just gets bigger and they sort of like, move off into the right in a crazy way. And you're like, you're caught in the morass of technical debt. Another thing is dynamic reteaming, okay, which is a thing that seems almost like an anti-Conway maneuver in a way. If we're recognizing that teams can impact the structure of design, and design, at least its structure tends to kind of get solidified rather early. At the very least, what we can do is we can bring new talent, to different areas of the system by being way more dynamic about how we approach our teams. Historically, within the industry, we've had this notion that a well-gelled work team is a great thing, but teams can become better at gelling. And if you have an organization where people are used to going and changing their team quite often, you can get to the point where basically people can form working relationships at work and sort of like give particular areas of the architecture the care and attention that they need when they need it. And, this is also a great thing too, because sometimes people become kind of like burned into a particular area of the system, and they start to basically lose any perspective of things that are happening within the rest of the code. So if you basically are kind of like a bit of a wanderer, you're going from place to place to place, that perspective helps you make better design decisions. So yeah, we can learn to reteam to what the software needs. Another thing is feature deletion, okay? Kind of like going and culling out the things that are in the system that are kind of problematic. And this is really hard to do in an organization because when you have money to spend, quite often you want to spend it on new features. But the thing is that people trip over existing code all the time that doesn't really work. I won't say it doesn't work. The code doesn't really provide value, right? It's important to go and kind of like look pretty much at the feature level and sort of ask yourself, how much money is this feature producing? You know, what customers are using it, which customers aren't? And ask yourself whether you need particular features. And then you can do analysis from that and go and say, okay, what code supports those features? Can we actually get rid of that code? And continually try to go and sort of like make your system a bit smaller. And you know, when you make things smaller, then basically you give people more mental cycles to be able to go and do new things. And you know, it's complexity tends to grow without bounds. So the things we can do to kind of like roll it back sometimes are things that go and give us extra capacity. Rotating between teams, I kind of alluded at this with dynamic reteaming. The notion is that it's really, really important to get new people to look at those areas of the system you're working on. Another Conway's law effect that people don't realize is that you can basically get so siloed into an area of the system that you start to think that what you're looking at is good code, but it really isn't anymore. You know, you're looking at it and it's kind of like, I understand this immediately because I've been here every week. I visit this particular area of the system, right? And then somebody new joins the team. They're kind of like, what the hell are you looking at? It's like, this makes no sense at all. And because they don't have the history with it that you do. So it's good to go and actually get new people on your team periodically and then basically visit other teams and at least be very direct and honest and go and say, this doesn't make any sense to me. And then basically people can start to go and see the difference between how the system exists today and their view of it, which is quite often much rosier than, you know, how it really exists. The other one is basically this, looking at the system as being a stakeholder, which is kind of a weird thing, but it's kind of fun as well. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to be kind of like getting into some interesting territory that's really kind of like high conceptual, but I'm going to kind of introduce it this way. We look at stakeholders and systems all the time, but do we ever consider the system itself as a stakeholder? I don't know. It's a funny thing. We can anthropomorphize the things that we're working on and get some benefit from it, which is kind of a fascinating thing to consider. If you are a sailor on a ship, quite often they have a name for the ship and they actually talk about the ship as if it was a person in a very jokey way. Where I used to live in Miami, Florida, we basically use human names for hurricanes, right? So we'll say this is Hurricane Sally or Hurricane Jet or something like that. And then you personify that particular thing. When you're working on a team, you can actually start to go and consider that different areas of the system, you know, are entities that have feelings, which is a strange thing to consider. But it's also like it might go and sort of give you a little bit more empathy for, you know, what hurts in a way, right? It can't feel great if you're a system that you basically have to go and invasively hack at over and over again in order to get features in. That's just not a system which is terribly healthy. So actually going and sort of like seeing our system itself as a stakeholder in the process, we start to develop the empathy to go and think about it in ways that basically allow us to lend care when we're going and doing our work. The final one is something that is really a fascinating technique that Colin Brecht basically did a talk at a conference a while back, quality views. And I encourage you to kind of like Google that. Google quality views and Colin, and you'll find his talk and some papers about this. The notion here is going and recognizing that, you know, as systems start to degrade in quality, we can basically go and sort of reflect this back into the business just by going and creating charts where we use colors to go and indicate the relative level of quality of the different pieces. And, you know, the notion is that you don't even really talk about technical debt with your business stakeholders at all. You just go and adjust the colors on all these things. And then when somebody says, well, we need to go and have this particular, you know, feature, you can say, okay, that's going to take this much time because you'll see that, you know, most everything here is kind of yellow and yellow is good. And then another feature, they'll say, well, this is going to take a little bit longer because that's touching this red area of the system where the quality isn't quite as high. And then you actually have the business people going and asking you to go and sort of like basically make the quality level higher in different areas of the system so that they can, you know, get the features that they want in a timely fashion. You know, and this comes down to this thing that, you know, we can look at the software system as a big entity and reflect that back into the organization so they can go and see, you know, how to go and basically treat it well so that it treats us well. But, you know, I think that's the thing. Basically, software becomes kind of baked in over time. We need to go and tend our systems to make them, you know, really better and sustainable over time within the organization. And the thing to recognize is that sometimes the older systems that we have, they are, they're very hard to change. We can do lots of things to re-architect things like that, but sometimes building new systems off to the side is the best thing you can do. You know, it's kind of like, sometimes I call this like sprouting or budding in a way, right? Rather than adding 15 features onto an existing product, can you create a new code base for those features and basically sort of like make this thing off to the side without going and making the original thing more complex? I think sometimes we just sort of have like goggles on in a sense, where you start going and seeing the system as one big system, and we don't see how we can break it down into smaller pieces, or at least create new pieces off to the side that go and accommodate the features that we know we need. So this is a way of going and applying Conway proactively, making a new team, have them make a new code base, maybe go and delegate to it from the existing application, but you can create new teams with new fresh code bases and use that as a new growth and structure on the side that doesn't have to go and get quite as tangled with the existing stuff that you have. Now, having said all that, I want to go and reflect something back to you, which is going to be a little bit odd, right? And it's this. Okay, so what is that? Anybody know? Okay, it's really a grain of sand. Okay, but it's interesting when you look at it. It has like all this substructure to it, right? It's got like particles in it and stuff along those lines. And we never really look at a grain of sand at this level of detail. Usually we just see a teeny little grain of sand and say, yay, we got one thing there, right? But if we look over here, this is a sand dune, you know. Now, is that one thing or is it billions of things, right? It's kind of like we have a choice in framing when we go and we say, okay, I identify a sand dune as a thing, right? You can also identify a grain of sand as a thing, but you can also identify the substructure of a grain of sand as things also, right? So quite often we sort of like see things that we in the world and we basically have a concept for them and we're like, okay, that's a person, right? And that's a light fixture and that kind of thing. But the choice of scale basically goes and impacts how we see the world an awful lot. And the thing I want to go and do with this is go and sort of tell you that the mystery of Conway's law, why technical structure ends up mirroring team structure, it's not really that much of a mystery. It's not really all that much magic in a way. It has to do with the way that we see things, the way that we're basically accustomed to seeing things. So anybody know what this is at all? Okay, this is a picture of something called a Mandelblub, right? And it's an attempt to basically make a 3D fractal using 3D printing. And it's not exactly like a 3D rendition of a Mandelbrot set, because you can't really make Mandelbrot sets in 3D, right? But it's like a fractal that's done in 3D. And the thing I'm going to argue is that essentially your organization, okay, and your code together looks like this, but you can't really see it, okay? That's kind of like a weird thing to say, isn't it? It's like, imagine there's all this structure that you can't really actually see. And that structure is really the way that your code and systems interact with your processes and your teams and your tools and all this other stuff. It's like this big, big structure. And it's not really immediately apparent to us. Okay. And here's a picture of another Mandelblub. It's kind of like that. But you can imagine that sometimes, you know, when you look at this, it's like there's other viewpoints too. Like here's something which is kind of like a Mandelbrot set, but it's kind of sliced and turned into like a flower vase, for instance. So we can take slices through this giant crazy structure that we can't see, and we can start to see the insides of it in a way. And that's kind of useful as a frame. Another one of those things too. So, you know, what I'm going to basically say to you is that, you know, your organization, the software that you're producing and the teams together, that's like your English muffin, right? And if you take an English muffin and you kind of hold it and you twist, you can break it apart without using a knife at all, right? Don't know if you can do that with crumpets, okay? But when you do that, you end up with something like this. Now, when you look at both sides of that muffin, you'll say, oh, wow, one side is mirroring the other. The structure on one side is exactly the same. And you can fit it back together again. And you're looking at it and you're saying, isn't it an interesting thing that the structure on one side is matching the structure of the other? And it's like, not really. It's kind of like what we had is we had one thing and we broke it down. And then we looked at it and said, oh, wow, look at the magic here. But that's what's really going on in our organizations, right? We look at how we see the same pattern in the technical solution that we see in the organizational structure. And what we didn't realize is that they're all really one thing together. Those two things kind of grew together. They're one thing. And if we choose to go and slice them and sort of say, hey, one side is the people and the other side is the technology, then we're kind of like, oh, we've got a mirroring that's going on here, okay? But that mirroring is really something which is really alive in a way, okay? We have this giant structure. We are part of the technical systems. The technical systems are part of us. And we interact with each other all the time, right? So all the choices and things that you do impact everything around you. They impact the people around you. They impact the technology that you're producing and all this. And as designers, we have to recognize that we're kind of like, we're basically going and building, we're kind of like building the house we're living in all the time, right? And we do that through tool choice. We do it through the coding that we do it through our interactions with our coworkers and all these things. So design is a way, way bigger thing than we ever think of. And I think, you know, I just want to go and kind of lend that frame over to you that that this is just really, Conway's law is really just almost like an introduction to systems thinking in a way. Recognizing that with this bigger frame, we can start to see that, you know, it's all just one thing. And we have lots of levers we can use to make things better. So with that, I want to kind of like hand it back, and I guess we can get into Q&A and everything. So, you know, thanks very much for inviting me, and it's been fun, you know, to go and talk about this and sort of tease everybody about English muffins and crumpets. And I guess we'll have to go and see if Jamie has any fun response to that too. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Michael. I think the first thing is from all of us is thank you very much for that, and a round of applause please for Michael. I remember, Michael, one of the best examples I saw of Conway's law came from industrial espionage. A computing company back in the early 80s stole a new motherboard from their rival. And when they opened up the computer, the motherboard mapped the organizational chart exactly.
Yep.
And apparently there was two guys who didn't like each other, and they had different places on the motherboard. They should have been in the same place.
Yeah, that's it. That's great. Yeah.
So thank you very much for that, Michael. That was awesome. We do have some questions coming in from the audience. Before we get to that, two pieces of housekeeping. You can ask a question in the chat box right now if you want to, and I'll relay that to Michael. Alternatively, if you are feeling brave and you want to unmute yourself and switch your camera on, you can ask the question yourself. While you're plucking up the courage to do that, let me go to the pre-asked questions. Okay, when are you going to write your next book? That's the first question.
Oh, which one, right? I've been really kind of busy and stuff like that too. I've got something underway which I call unconditional code, and it's about, I've done some talks about this, and it's about reducing conditionality both in software and also in process in order to go and make things better. But that's been kind of like on the hold. But yeah, I got to get back into it. So yeah, so keep pestering me.
Dr. Dre thought about writing a sequel to The Chronic for 25 years before he gave up. But he was umming and ahhing about, for 2 decades, yeah. And then he was like, do you know what, I'd like to come. Dr. Dre.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, because The Chronic was his last proper album. And then he was like, right, I got to do The Chronic too. And then he never got round to it. But I'm sure your book's going to come out.
Yeah, I'll figure something out. I need collaborators. I mean, that's what I need to do. So.
Right, here's an interesting one that brings in the world of cloud native and cloud transformation and Conway's law. If you're going through a cloud transformation, what's the best way to start to tackle organizational changes? And how do you, quote unquote, sell this to management?
My God, it's such a general question, really. You know, it's, every situation is a bit different with that. I think a lot of it really is basically going and sort of like telegraphing the need for the technology and you know, getting people trained in that particular area. And then going and basically preparing everybody for change, right? Because it's kind of like there's the change itself, but also going and getting people used to the idea that things are going to be changing. And sometimes, I think with organizational change, it's good to go and basically do a bunch of small changes and give people the confidence that they can go through a set of changes, and that, yeah, it's scary in the beginning, but we're going to be moving faster now. And, change isn't something to be scared of. So you make lots and lots of small, safe, dramatic changes, and then get people used to change. And then you can make the bigger changes. I think that's one thing that kind of helps it out quite a bit.
I suppose in that sense, not much changes, right? In 30 years or 100 years, training, getting people into what's about to come next.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and again, it's like, it's funny. I was talking about, social systems moving faster than code does, but still social systems move pretty slow also, right? I think there's kind of like a change muscle you can use sometimes in organizations. If the organization is used to being rather dynamic, then, change is pretty easy. But if things are kind of like encased in a way, then you have some work to do to get people used to that kind of dynamicity.
The funny thing about cloud native is that there is no shortcut whatsoever. People are looking for this, but even with extreme programming, Michael, it's a change that changes everything. Changes the way you think, changes the way you organize, changes the way you hire. And for the last 20 years, we were quite polite. Oh, you should start small. And more recently, we've been like, listen, if you're not into this shit, it ain't going to work, right? You take this stuff seriously, and you'll succeed with it.
Yeah, you can't do it half-assed.
Yeah, you can't half-ass it. And to be fair, a lot of executives understand this nowadays, which is good, which is a positive change from, way back when. Okay, one more question.
Just to add, this was my question, Alexander. But this is a good point. A lot of executive understands this already. What about the ones that don't understand it? So how you can explain them that technology, that the software and the organization is somehow close together. So how you sell this to the executive to do the organization changes needed?
Yeah, I don't know. I find a lot of people that head up organizations are decent systems thinkers. They just may not be used to taking that systems thinking and applying it to a different domain, like basically seeing the interface between technology and their organization, right? So yeah, like any type of communication task, you have to kind of work with the analogies and metaphors that would work with them, sometimes, basically going in and sort of like piecing things in, in the terminology of their business, that kind of thing.
There's a really...
The thing that's fascinating to me is that people, today they basically know when they're being left behind, right? And then basically, it's like, if people recognize the problem, then they'll listen. And then you have ways of going and sort of like, approaching this conversation about how all these things tie together. And sometimes that happens only as a side effect of like, when you propose something, they'll say, well, why are you doing this? And you'll say, well, it's because these things are really linked. And then you have to go through how one thing impacts the other. And then after a little while, people start to go and see how the technology and the social systems have that linkage.
There's a really good article in Harvard Business Review about how executives are very comfortable with large-scale change. That's their job. They move into new geographies, they launch new products all the time. But with cloud native, because it's new to them, or cloud technology, all of a sudden they lose their minds temporarily. And the risk-averse processes that they would usually follow, proof of concepts, feasibility studies, they abandon them. And then these quick ramp-ups are followed by, these embarrassing ramp-downs.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think that's the thing. It's good to get guidance. It really helps, when you're doing something that big. And it's fortunate there's lots of people who've done it already. And
of course, the second part to answer that question, Michael, from me at least, would be if people don't, you could always leave and find a new job. I mean, the cloud native is difficult. Don't do it unless you're serious. But you can only hit your head against the wall so many times. And then maybe you should put your energies in other places.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's a challenge.
Does anybody else want to? No? Yeah, I mean, life's too short, right?
Yeah.
There's enough people out there doing amazing work. Go and play with them.
And that's a big thing for many organizations today. Is it's kind of like, I always go back to this story of like one time I went to China years ago, and I remember like working with some people over there on a system that was like, it was a 3-company ago system where basically it's kind of like it was made at one company, it was sold to another company, sold to another company, and then ended up in China, basically with people going and doing, maintenance work on it and using extremely old tools because they couldn't get rid of the system, but they also couldn't change it all that effectively. And it's just rough with this to kind of recognize that these things you will get left behind and have to do something with it. Quite often talent goes to more interesting and exciting things. So, not only are you going to be losing in market if you're not doing some of these things, you're also going to be losing your best people, unfortunately. Yeah.
The last webinar we did, Michael, we spoke about ING Bank in the Netherlands. And by going early with DevOps and later cloud native, they won the war for users, great, and they won the war for talent. It's now a very cool place to work.
It's all one.
Nobody wants to go work at it.
Yeah, it's all
yeah, for sure.
That's the thing too. Like the
right,
the
it
door,
looks like the
like door research, like DevOps, stuff
say,
like that. It's like it's all basically points out how culture is actually sometimes downstream of like even like release cadence and stuff like that. All these things are tied together.
Yeah, absolutely. And the world has changed for the better. We're iterating more, we're experimenting more, we've become more entrepreneurial. And nowadays we think that business is around conserving the balance sheet. This is a very modern view. This is a view of the last 30 years. In the 60s and 70s, people still spoke about being entrepreneurial within large organizations.
Yeah.
Right, it looks like the debate has started, which is really positive. So I'm going to ask again, does anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask a question directly and see if we can get a bit of conversation going with Michael?
Cool.
I can.
Go ahead, Rob. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Michael, I found the Mandelbrot pictures, sculptures, a bit disturbing, to be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe depressing even. So you're sort of saying it's a complex thing, and there are interesting slices through them. And my puzzle is a bit. So if that's the case, and then how to find the useful slices, how to find the useful projections that can help you to get insights and to.
Well, it's an analogy, and I think it's kind of like the only reason I'm kind of like presenting that is to go and say that we've got a predefined slice in the way that we look at that, and that slice is like we've got people on one side, technology on the other, right?
Right.
And I'm just offering that essentially we could ignore that slice and see what the thing is before we break it apart. And just looking at that, we kind of recognize that it's kind of like it's not a mystery that one side of the slice looks the same as the other side of the slice at the same point, right? So that's just that's the only purpose of the blob thing. It's like it is a bit disturbing, but I also like like H.R. Giger, for instance, as an artist, so it doesn't disturb me quite as much. But the purpose of that analogy is to go and point out that when we see mirroring on the social side and the technical side, it's because it's one thing, and it's like we see people and technology as different, and there's another perspective where it's all just one thing, and so it's not a mystery. It's really not a mystery that this mirroring happens. It's kind of
okay.
Like,
so I think I viewed it.
These things as separate, but they're all one big thing.
So I think I viewed it like there's probably more different slices that can be interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting with that too, because there are places where you can basically use technology to replace humans and humans to replace technology, right? So you can go and sort of like look at things that way. But I think the general maneuver though of going and sort of like looking at things from a different frame and considering several things together as one can be kind of useful in design thinking as well. But yeah, I was really just bringing it out to go and sort of like highlight that particular understanding.
Okay, thank you.
No
Thank you, Rob. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
I think we've got time for a couple more. This is an interesting one, Michael, especially given what's happening with the pandemic and the changing working habits we develop. How do you organize remote teams, and how do they affect quality and speed of software and software development?
Yeah, how do you organize remote teams? It's the thing that's amazing is that people have been doing this for years prior to COVID, right? It's there have been a lot of people going and doing like remote teams, so usually like an open source and stuff along those lines. So I don't think there's any special magic around that. It's just It really is better when people have like a work history together in terms of like maybe they actually were co-located at one point in time. But beyond that, it's kind of like it's a matter of going and actually just getting people to share calls and do things like that. I'm finding more and more, even though I felt kind of like this visceral kind of like, you know, like, oh, that's kind of crazy, you know, thing about mob programming or ensemble programming, as it's called now. I feel more and more that it's like there's something there to that, right? If we can't really be co-located, if we can have like several people working on the code at the same time, we're sharing the knowledge as it's generated. We're working on something in common. And, you know, it can be very valuable, right? And I know some companies that basically do ensemble programming almost exclusively. And they see great benefit in it, even though it looks like it's that thing of like, oh, you know, too many people working on the same thing at once. It's pretty much the same critique that was leveled against pair programming in the very beginning. So yeah, I've also been reflecting an awful lot recently on how pull requests are really kind of, nobody likes going and handling them. Isn't it better to go and actually have the review be way more dynamic and have, you know, maybe, you know, 4 people working on something at once and feeling confident in checking it in. So I think that if we basically stay in this distributed realm, we should be looking for opportunities to go and do things like ensemble programming a bit more, because we are losing all this ambient information by not being co-located with each other. And, you know, because of Conway's law, it gets reflected in the code. You'll end up having, you know, different styles and stuff like this because the communication is not quite as tight as it would be because we're distributed.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned pull requests. I mean, I've not developed actively now for more than 10 years, but I do get the feeling, I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't offend anybody or everybody. I get the feeling for those people who would rather not have face-to-face interactions, pull requests are a way to get stuff integrated without necessarily giving feedback. I don't think pull requests are a replacement for pair programming and active code review. And as a matter of fact, I think they've become a way to put more alienation between people on a team.
Yeah, and you know, it's a weird thing about this too, because I'll just sort of like, you know, share this, but I was a terribly shy teenager, you know, and kid. And at one point I thought I would be a pharmacist because I wouldn't have to look people in the eye at all. I just fill their prescriptions. And that was the line of work I thought I was set for because of my temperament, right? But it's interesting to notice that basically software development has become way more social, but we still have lots and lots of people who are very strong introverts who want to do software development and everything. So I think everything can be accommodated that way. And I think sometimes the people who are not apt to basically go and engage in conversations about what they're working on all that much, you know, it's great if they can kind of like, you know, have responsibility for, you know, like prototyping, you know, proof of concepts and moving into that realm. You know, sometimes that kind of can help them, you know, find their place in this. But the fact of the matter is, if you're working on a small thing, you can do it as a one-person thing. If you're working on the systems at the scale that we're dealing with today, you are going to be interacting with people, and the systems are going to be interacting with other systems. So it's really a communication-intensive job, way more than we really expected it to be.
I think that changed, maybe going back to that story from the beginning when we talked about KLM in the mid-noughties. I think that changed when all of a sudden one person couldn't do everything. So back then, you know, if you could do something in Linux and you could, you know, program a bit, do a bit of HTML, you could do quite a lot of work. But in this world we live in now, this cloud native world, you're not only doing infrastructure, bit of Linux programming, but you're also doing user experience. And then you're thinking, and user and design people, you know, visual design people are different to coders. And all of a sudden, if you don't play nice, because this is a core value at Container Solutions, it's not like we want people who collaborate for the sake of collaboration, but if you don't play nice, you can't get by in this multifunctional world we live in.
And not only that, it's kind of like, you know, getting back to that thing of like, it's all one system. It's kind of like, if you're not playing nice, you're making an architectural choice to have a system that's discordant.
Yeah,
you know,
you might not. People find this hard to believe, like, but I'm an introvert actually. On all the psych evaluations, I'm actually an introvert. I do not need other people. The fact that I'm allowed in webinars like this is because I'm doing a job. But ultimately, I think the last 15 years is about like, right, what tricks and tips can we learn, and what structures can we bring in place to compensate for, you know, our weaknesses and play to our strengths. We do a lot of work with psychologists at Container Solutions because not because there's anything wrong with us per se, but we're looking for that advantage. How do we create an environment for introverts to thrive, because you can't just chuck them in meetings, right? Because you get exhausted from that from other people. And all of this is very, very interesting.
It is, it really is.
Right. I think we've got, Carla, how many more questions have we got time for? 1 or 2?
I think at least 2. Yeah.
At least 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this is an interesting question. Oh, speaking of psychology, okay. Knowing that change in organizational structure is the hardest of them all, it makes me feel a little helpless sometimes. How can I face or help C-levels face and hopefully overcome these feelings of helplessness?
Feelings of helplessness. I think like many things in life are basically taking small steps, right? It's kind of like if you're scared, then basically do something simple that you're not scared of, and then discover that that's going okay, then take the next bigger step, right? I mean, that's basically very generic advice around all this stuff. I think the other thing with this though too is if you're basically doing something like a cloud native transformation, it really pays to go and talk to other people that have done it. And I think the interesting thing with so much of this is that this is not really like a competitive thing, in the sense that like, oh, say you're an insurance company and you're about to do something kind of radical, and the only other people that are doing it are like another insurance company, and you can't basically talk to them because you're competitors, right? People are doing the same kind of stuff in cloud native in completely different domains than yours. And so basically seeking those people out, seeking out consultants who've done it, all these things, there's a lot of support out there if you're able to reach across industries, because the competition isn't really a big deal in that space.
Are you basically saying, Michael, that we have a responsibility to seek out support? You have to find your people.
Yeah, totally. Well, the thing is, the alternative is to basically sit and be scared, right? So it's like we have to kind of like move forward, and it's really kind of cool to go and recognize that there are lots of people around you that have done this and are doing it. And I think that's a good way of not feeling alone about it, and then basically knowing that.
It's interesting, because when I started Container Solutions, of course I was nervous, anxious about would it succeed, and then I started to become anxious. What if it succeeds too much? Could I handle the pressure? And I remember it's about 7 years ago, 2 things at the same time happened. One of them, I was reading a book about philosophy, and the author had said something along the lines of, the 6 billion people out there, it's probably 7 billion by now, the 6 billion people out there, some of them might actually help you. So go and find those people. And then at the same time, I did an executive course at the Rotterdam Business School, and they literally talked about networking. And they basically said, who do you need today emotionally, and who do you need next year emotionally in terms of your support network? Go and find them. And of course, this is what you get taught at business school, but nobody teaches us in engineering.
No. And I guess that's because a lot of us are kind of like introverts and trying to avoid all that stuff, right? So it's kind of like, that's the way it was for me in years, right? But it's like, I think at a certain point, you kind of recognize that to grow, you're going to need other people, and and to design well. And if you really care about the craft, you want to design well, and then you're like, okay, well, I need to basically manage my interface with other people in such a way that I can basically design effectively. Otherwise, the thing I'm working on is going to suffer,
Yeah. We keep using that word. I suppose you made me think of that book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is, on the one hand, it's a complete cliche. It appears in movies, but on the other hand, that's its whole premise, isn't it? That we will not do great work until we learn to play well with others.
Yeah, no, it's true, but it's rough on us introverts. And honestly, I mean, I've been successful in what I'm doing, but I really am an introvert at heart, and it is a struggle sometimes to go and say, oh, it's like, yeah, I'm going to talk to a bunch of people, but no, it's you have to go and work against your own inclinations sometimes to do things.
Yeah.
But
most things go wrong for me when I spend too much time alone working on something. This is when things go wrong, because my job is not to do that. My job is to be with other people and make sure things are moving. Right, we're coming close to the end now. Does anybody have any more questions for Michael, or comments or suggestions?
I'll give it a try.
Great.
If you don't mind.
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Go for it.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, so bear with me. So from your experience, do you have maybe either exactly or the same experience or maybe contradictory experience to the following situation. Yeah. So you're building a new product with a small team, but you're already building an organizational chart that is reflecting functional structures like platform team and maybe application team and so on, and QA. But effectively being staffed with maybe a low amount of people, and if it's at the same time trying to draft the architecture that is potentially scalable and so on. So does that make sense in your experience to prepare for some kind of scaling that should probably happen sometime in the next 6 to 12 months, maybe?
I guess the big question is like, how are you preparing? I think having thought experiments about how you would actually do things is a very valuable thing to do in terms of like actually like investing in changing your architecture to anticipate change that may not happen. That's, that can be a little bit problematic at times. I think some of this goes back to, and I think Jamie would appreciate this a lot, the early extreme programming principle, you're not going to need it, right? Which was like always contentious back then, but it was saying that, you might be planning to make a giant framework for something, but just go and write the code to solve the simple problem today. And when you do that, you end up producing something which is focused and integratable in a bigger solution as your requirements change and you need more stuff, right? So there's like a truth to design, which is really all about concentrate on the simple. And when you concentrate on the simple, you are poised to go and basically do bigger things when you need to. And that generally holds true for a lot of things with regard to architecture and things along those lines too. Like in the Java days, people would talk about POJOs, plain old Java code, where basically it's just like you're not having interfering technologies. You're just going and making the simplest plain vanilla Java code without dependencies, and you can take that and integrate it in many different areas. So I would say that, thought experiments where you look at how you would break things off into, functional areas and stuff like that are all great, but try to go and sort of like nourish that small team and kind of grow them that way for a while, make them aware that change may be coming, but you've got a sweet spot when you have a small team of people working on something. And that's a really a nice thing to go and sort of like keep yourself in that space as long as you can. You can be very highly effective as a small team.
You've used this word many times today, Michael, design.
Yeah.
And it's a word many people don't understand. When you design action, it's called strategy.
Yeah, totally.
when you restructure your organization, it's called organizational design. And I think there's too much typing. There's too much typing in our industry, which to me indicates a lack of thinking and a lack of design. And I think if we could draw anything from, maybe the 70s and 80s, it is true what we said in XP. You ain't going to need it, and that was a call to action because people were too ponderous. But at the same time, why explore through the design space when you know what the solution looks like? But we don't talk enough about thinking. How should we think, and how should we design?
Yeah, I totally agree. Right,
on that note, I'm going to share my screen because I've got one or two more announcements. There's time for one more question, but so while I'm doing this, if you want to ask that question, please go ahead. Otherwise, we're going to start to move into that weird part of the webinar where we say thank you and goodbye, because at a physical event, it's so easy to thank everybody and say goodbye. On an online event, it's always really weird because you're like, okay, well, thank you, bye.
Yeah. All the people I never saw, right? Yeah.
What's that, Michael?
All the people I never saw, they're here, right?
they're all here and they're all listening. And I can tell you now, there's been hardly any drop-offs, which is a sign that people have really enjoyed this. Nobody stays on a call for 90 minutes if they think it's shit. So well done to you. Before we say thank you to Michael, there's one more announcement from me. Firstly, Teresa or Carla will share in the chat box a link to a feedback form. It only takes 1 minute to complete. We ain't messing about, people. We love to provide awesome content. We want to help. We don't want to spam you. Let us know what we've done right, but more importantly, let us know what we screwed up, and we'll get it right the next time, I promise. The second thing is we've got an SRE conference, and actually Conway's Law will reappear in this conference multiple times. I guarantee it. It's a free conference. It's very much in the spirit of all of our work. We're bringing people together. We're doing knowledge transfer. We're trying to break the monotony during the pandemic. If you want to sign up, We're only 15 people short of 1,000. Those are my final 2 announcements. This leaves me to say only one more thing. We're 30 seconds out, Michael, 30 seconds from completion. I'd like to ask you to unmute yourselves and give a round of applause, first of all, to Carla and Teresa, the events organizers at Container Solutions. Well done, and thank you for this. I'd like you to keep that going for the wonderful gossip section from Adrian and Ricardo and the presentation of that. Wonderful facilitation from me, your host. Thank you very much. Bravo. And of course, the biggest round of applause for our wonderful guest, Michael, who's dialed in all the way from California to give a fantastic session where people have stuck around and asked some fantastic questions. Michael, thank you.
Yeah.
We will see you all at the next time. Michael, it was good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thanks.
We'll see you all at the next one. Keep the questions coming, share on Twitter, and one more time, thank you all very much indeed. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
All right.